Okay, I'm going to attempt to give what would probably best be described as a 10,000 foot overview of a Power Automate that I've written, which interrogates the iSAMS API. It extracts data. In this instance, it's employee data. It creates a Word document. It uploads that Word document to a SharePoint library and then applies appropriate permissions to the SharePoint library so that only the specific member of staff who is entitled to view that information has access to that document. There's two really fundamental reasons as to why I did this. Firstly, I wanted to see how far I could go with actually connecting Power Automate with the iSAMS API. And secondly, it's become apparent that, unless I'm mistaken, there doesn't seem to be an easy way of a member of staff checking the details that the school has about them on iSAMS, unless, of course, they have access to the HR module. So when our human resources department would like the members of staff to check the information that is stored to ensure that it's correct, there isn't really an easy way of providing that. So that's sort of what sits behind this. The first thing that you'll notice is there's a lot of variables involved in this Power Automate. Now, some of these variables are just arrays for storing information that's been returned back from the API, and other variables are just for storing pieces of text for future use. What I won't do is go through each individual variable. I'll sort of raise them as I come across it, because, as I said, this is more of an overview. It's not a granular blow-by-blow account of how every formula works and how every action works, because aside from that probably taking about an hour to go through, I suspect would also become rather boring. So I'm going to just zoom in to give a better view. Okay, so I've just got this running on a recurrence. I mean, that can be a trigger. It can be anything you like. As I said, I'm not going to go through all of these variables. I'll raise them as I come to them. The first thing I need to do is I need to do an HTTP post request. Now, this is how you connect to the iSAMS API. Now, iSAMS will be able to provide you with the appropriate connection details and the client ID and the client secret. This is quite well documented, so I'm not going to go through that process. But in effect, what we're needing to do is to connect to the iSAMS API endpoint with an HTTP post request and return back what is in effect a token. Once the request has been made, the data that comes back is in a JSON format, and within that JSON format within that data is the token that you will then need in order to make all subsequent calls to get information. There's all sorts of documentation on the internet as to how to what they call parse the JSON so that you can easily extract this information. So I'm not going to go through that. But in effect, that's what I do, is I bring that information in, and then I'm going to use our first variable. Well, actually, it's not, because we've used variables in connecting to the endpoint, but we're using this Auth token variable. And what I'm doing here is I'm taking the information that I took from the previous action, and I'm creating this value which says bearer space and then whatever the access token is. Once I have this access token, this is now what I'll use for all future requests to get information. So in effect, at this point, we haven't got any data. All we've done is actually make a connection point to the iSAMS API. Now, the one thing that I've done, and I've sort of listed this throughout this Power Automate, is I've done a lot of these, what they call try-catch processes. This is many people will probably know, it's very much a programming concept where you try an action, and if that action fails, you perform something else. Poor explanation, but you get the idea. The reason behind this is because as part of this journey, I did come across a problem where the time that it was taken to run this was exceeding an hour, certainly if I was doing it for every member of staff. And the problem with that is that the token that you receive back from iSAMS only lasts for 1 hour. So of course, halfway through the process, the authentication was failing because the token had in effect expired. So that's why I'm using these try-catch processes, and I'll explain briefly how I do that. So what I do is, to give an example, the first thing I do is I'm making a call. In this instance, I'm actually getting the number of pages of information that are returned, and I'll come back to that in a second. But the reason why I'm putting that in a try is because if that by any chance has failed, normally because the time may have expired, although in fairness, because this is the first call it's really making, the chances are this won't have expired, but it may have expired on a further process down the line. What I'm doing is I'm then in this catch option, I'm basically retrying the whole process of going and getting a token. And this is a pattern that I'm using throughout this whole Power Automate. So in effect, I've got a process that I'm doing here, which I'll come to in a second, but I've got this catch which says that if for any reason that fails, go and get me another token. And all I'm doing here is repeating the original process at the start of this Power Automate that goes and gets the token. The principle behind that being that if an hour has passed, it goes and gets another token. And you work these try catches, or you configure these try catches by clicking on the three little dots, and there's this option here that says configure the run after. And you'll notice that I've got options of saying when I'm going to run this particular process. So I'm saying I'm only going to run if the try option has failed, is skipped, or has timed out. I'm not going to run if it's successful. So the principle behind that, if I close that up, is that if this try, if this try option fails, it will then run this catch one, which is a complete re-authentication. If the try pages has been successful, it will completely ignore this and go straight on to the next section. So the first thing that and you'll notice throughout all of my Power Automate, pretty much everything is wrapped up in these try catches. If I go back to the try catches, the try of the try pages, I'll try and explain basically what I'm doing here. The one thing with the iSAMS API is it will only give you 100 records at a time. Now, in some instances, that may be perfectly fine. But if you're wanting to bring back information about all members of staff, there is a high likelihood you're going to get more than 100 records. And the way they work is that they will provide you information of how many pages are involved in this return. So for example, if I've got 150 members of staff, it's going to tell me that there are 2 pages involved in that. The first page is the first 100, and then page 2 is the following 50. So what I need to do initially is to establish how many pages are involved. And again, I'm doing a specific call here. I'm not going to go through the URL, but you get the idea. You make a call, you get the information back, and you extract the pages information. And then what I'm doing is I have a variable which I'm currently resetting to the value of 0, and I am then setting my total pages to the value that has been returned in the previous step. So if I've got 150 members of staff, that is going to say 2, and it's going to set my variable total pages to 2. The one thing that you'll also notice, and I sort of glossed over it a little bit here, was this reset option. I may have sort of gone a bit overboard with some of these resets, but it was causing me a few problems. So I am now taking to resetting my variables every time before I need to use them. I was getting issues where I clearly hadn't reset a variable and it was then appending data to the previous value, and it was becoming quite problematic. So the one thing you'll notice throughout the whole of this Power Automate is that before I use a variable, I'm pretty much always resetting it to what I want the default to be. So that's basically what I've done here. I'm resetting this total pages and then I'm setting it to whatever total pages is. So that's in effect all this try pages and, in the case of it failing, catch pages is doing, is just giving me information on how many pages are involved in the data that I'm returning. Okay, so I then go on to this finally. Finally is just to show you how that's configured. It's the configure after run. But what I'm doing here is I'm ticking everything. So I'm in effect saying that if the catches pages has been successful, I mean, you could argue if it's failed or skipped or is timed out. Oh no, actually, I do need to say it's skipped, because if the original try succeeded, then of course this stage would indeed be skipped. So what I'm doing is I'm ticking everything. So the result being is that this final stage will run irrespective of what has happened on the previous two stages of try and catch. And that's what I want. I want this stage to run. Okay, the next process is that I'm now doing a do until. This is sort of like a looping function. And what I've got here is I'm basically saying do until the current page, and current page is a variable that I have set, one of those original variables, which I have currently set to be 1. And I'm saying whilst current page is greater, do until the current page is greater than the total pages. And we know that total pages is 2 in our example, because that's what the previous pages process got. So this will do whatever I'm now going to put in this do until loop. It will do that until the current page is greater than total pages. So in other words, if I've got 2 pages of data, it's going to run this process twice. That's in effect what I'm saying. Another gotcha, just to bear in mind, because this caught me out as well, is that under this change limits option, the default for a do until is 1 hour. I've now changed this to say 24. The problem I had is, again, because this process was taking more than an hour, it was in effect stopping this whole part of the Power Automate after an hour. And in other words, I wasn't actually moving on to the next page, and that took me a while to fathom that out. So I've exceeded the timeout. This do until can in theory run for 24 hours. Of course, it doesn't run for that long, but it can run for 24 hours. Okay, so I've now made my connection to the database. I've now got my total number of pages, so I know how many times I need to loop over this. I'm now going to actually go and get data. So again, I've got this pattern of putting it in a try and a catch and a finally. I'm not going to go through that every time. The principle is the same. If this times out, it will go and get a fresh token so that it can in effect maintain a connection to the data. But this try is another HTTP endpoint. Now, again, I'm not going to go through what all of these endpoints are. They're well documented. There is a Swagger that you can view, which tells you all of the iSAMS REST API endpoints. So you can go and have a look at that. But this particular area is going to look at, I've got it in a variable here. And what it's going to do is it's going to look at the current page that I am on. So of course, the first one is going to be 1. And then when it does its second iteration, the second loop, that's then going to be 2. So it's going to do this, this call. It's going to pass in the auth token just as it did before. So this is the original token that I got that's given me permission to make this request. And it's bringing back information that I'm then appending, or I'm putting in, to an array. Now this array is where I'm basically storing my information about that comes back from that endpoint about members of staff. And if I open this up, you'll see that I have a results array. This is a variable I've created, which is an array, and I'm basically populating that with employees. Now, again, I'm not going to say this every time, but just to reiterate, I'm always resetting these variables before I come to use them. So in the case of an array, I'm actually resetting it with these two square brackets, as I understand the best way to reset an array. So I'm starting with a fresh array and I'm populating that with the information that has come back from this employee stage. Now, to a large extent, if all I wanted was the data that came back from employees and I wasn't interested in any other information, I could now move on to just creating the Word document. But in my instance, I actually wanted to experiment with bringing information back from different endpoints, because the employee's information has a lot of core data, but it doesn't have things such as the contacts that are attached to a member of staff, or indeed the custom fields. And I wanted to see if I could then bring in custom fields and contact information as well. So I haven't yet finished with getting my data, because I wanted to go and get two other more endpoints of data. So just to explain how I've done that, I'm just going to close this up to make it easier to view. I'm not going to describe the catch again. Hopefully you get the idea as to why I've done the catch. It pretty much does the same routine, but it just does that initial request to get the token again. So it's exactly as I explained before. But there's a finally. Same principle. This will run every time. And what I'm doing on this finally is that first of all, I'm incrementing this variable here by 1. Because if I don't do that, it's not going to step the loop up by 1 and it will just keep going round. So I'm incrementing the variable by 1. So I had an integer variable that was currently set to 1, and I'm incrementing it by 1. So it's now saying 2. And what I'm then doing is I'm using this option here to filter the array down. I could really just take the array as it came, but in my instance I actually wanted to have the ability of being able to filter out that array, and I've got this little formula here which is basically saying reduce that result so that it's only showing those members of staff where the status is current. So in other words, they're a current member of staff, and actually also it contains the surname contains a variable that I created at the top of this Power Automate called user query. And this is where I can restrict it down so it might only be bringing back those members of staff whose surname is Norman or has NOR in it or something like that. So it sort of gave me some ability to reduce the results down. As far as I'm aware, I could be wrong, there's no way of filtering the results from the API end. When you make a call to the iSAMS API, you get the data. You can't sort of pass in an OData query or something like that actually does the filtering on their server end. So that's why I've had to reduce the results here. So once I have my filtered array, I'm then applying or performing an apply to each. So what this will then do is this will go through whatever those results are. And bearing in mind, we're still only on the first page because this entire routine is all within a do until. So this is just doing it for the first 100 records. And what it's basically going to do is it's going to do another call to go and get the contacts of the particular record it's currently working on. So here I've got another GET request. Again, I'm not going to go through how the iSAMS endpoints work, but I mean in this particular instance it's just the ID of the person in question and the word contacts after. Now this is a variable because obviously it's looking at the current record. It's passing in the authentication token again because I'm making a fresh request to the iSAMS endpoint. And what I'm then doing is I'm resetting my contacts array and then I am appending this contacts information into the contacts array. So I've now got a secondary array of data, if you like. So I've got my original one that I'm currently working through, and then for every one that I'm working through, I'm going out and getting the contacts. So those that might be familiar with SQL, it's a little bit like a one-to-many join kind of approach. So now I have my contacts. I'm then going to perform a finally, and what I'm doing here, this is slightly different. I sort of added this in, is that I've got an array of contacts, but what I need to do is I need to now sort of put all of those into a string field, because I'm going to use that string field when I come to do the word mail merge process. But what I'm doing here is that I noticed that whenever there is a contact in iSAMS, there is always a self record, and those that know iSAMS will understand this. The self record is in effect the same person. So it's not really an additional contact, it's the person's own contact. And I already have that information from the original call that I made to the employee endpoint. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually saying for every contact that I've got in my array, bearing in mind I've built this array up, I'm actually performing this function here which says if the relationship within that array is not equal to self, and if it's not equal to self, and I'm just going to maybe just zoom out a little here to make it a bit easier to see. If it's not equal to self, then I need to append it to my other variable called contact details. Now, just a little tip here is that a lot of these comparisons that I'm doing is I'm using this to lower option. And what that really does, again, it's a bit of a common pattern in programming where, because we don't know whether people have necessarily put self in uppercase or lowercase or whatever, to bring them all to a common comparison, I'm basically saying lowercase everything and then compare it to lowercase self. So it just means that I'm not getting tripped up by case issues. Anyway, once I've done that, I'm basically appending those results, and these are the results that come down, and I'm basically adding that to this string field, which I'm going to then use to embed into my Word document. I've got a little function here which basically just appends all of the individual address 1, address 2, to make it one field, because the data that actually comes back is a line at a time. You could just put this down as address line 1, address line 2, but I've created a formula that just in effect makes it one field. So if I scroll down, I'm now finally, so I'm doing 3 connections here. I'm getting the staff, I'm getting the contacts that are relevant to the staff, and then I'm getting the custom fields. So again, I'm using the process of a try and a catch just in case it's timed out. And what I'm doing here is I'm making a call to the custom field endpoint using the same process. It's the ID of the current record I'm on using my authentication token. I'm resetting this array that I've got called custom field, and I'm appending all of the custom fields to that array. And again, I've got the catch in case it times out, and then I have the finally here. And because custom fields can be many, there's not just one custom field, I've got to sort of do a very similar thing as I did with the contacts. I've got to loop through those. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the array that I've now just populated, and I could just leave it at that and have all custom fields. But again, I wanted to experiment with filtering that down. So what I did is I basically said only get the custom fields where the area, this is a value that you get back, is equal to school. There's all sorts of different categories of custom fields, and what that will do is that will bring back for me I've called it get safeguarding, because we have a safeguarding tick box, if you like, and it is under the area of school. And again, very much like the contacts, I'm appending the results to this text field called custom field, which I will then use to embed in the Word document. So that's been a little bit of a marathon there, but to sort of give an overview, what we've done is we've made a connection to the iSAMS API. We've got our authentication token. We've then gone and made a request to the employee's endpoint. We've established how many pages are being returned, and if there is more than one page of results, I'm then looping through that. So if there's 3 pages, 2 pages, it will do this whole process twice. I'm then within that going and getting the core information about the employee. I'm then within that going and finding whether there are any contact details for each individual record as I'm going through the for each. I'm then going and finding if there are any custom fields that meet a certain criteria within the for each. So we've got a lot of sort of like inner loops within inner loops going on here, but the result is we're going to get a data set back that's more than just the staff information. It's going to have the custom fields and it's going to have the contacts. So the final stage that we really want to get to now is actually creating the document. And bearing in mind, we're still within the do until loop here. So this is all doing it for every record. So what I'm doing is I'm populating a Word template. Now, again, I'm not going to go through the process of how you create these. There's a lot of documentation on how to populate a Word document from Power Automate. It's a sort of mail merge-esque kind of approach. And what I'm doing is I've got these fields created on the template that I'm using, this employee.docx file, and I'm basically populating it with the information that I have returned. So where I've got it from the raw information from the initial employee's call, the initial employee's connection, I can literally go and grab the information directly. Where it's more of an inner loop, like contacts, I've then got to append that string that I had that was results of that other query. And the same thing applies down here when I come to the custom fields. So anything that looks like this is coming directly from the first query, and these are the results of the subsequent queries. Okay, so I'm sort of finished with the iSAMS aspect now, and what we're now going to do is to actually create the document itself. Now, the one thing I've learned is that when you're creating a Word document in SharePoint, it's not particularly easy just to overwrite it. You can copy and move and delete, but you can't just overwrite. It will give you an error. So the first thing I've got to do is I've got to actually go and see whether the document actually exists already. So again, I'm not going to go into the formulas, but in effect, I'm now looking to see whether this document already exists. If the document does exist, then I'm basically deleting it. So I'm running through the document, and just to show you how I've done that, I've got this configure run after, and what I'm saying here, if I've managed to, if the previous step that said go and get this document, if it's successful, so in other words the document exists, then run this delete option. And all I'm doing here is I'm just saying if the name of the document has got the word iSAMS data extract in it, because when I create the document, which was further up the Power Automate, which I didn't go into, I've actually named it the name of the user, the ID of the user, and the current date, and the word iSAMS data extract. And the reason I've done that is so I can hook into it here and then in effect delete the file. So I'm basically removing the file as long as it matches the term iSAMS data extract. If the file failed, because in effect the file didn't exist, then it will miss out this if no error stage, and it will go straight to the finally. And again, the finally is configured by saying if this previous stage is either been skipped or is successful. So this finally stage is going to run at every point. And what I'm doing here is I'm setting a variable, and the variable I'm setting is the school email address that has come out of iSAMS. So for every school record, there is the ability to enter a school email address. And this is quite crucial because this is what's going to govern how we set permissions on these files. Once I have that variable, I basically just create the new file. And the new file is, again, I won't go through the way that I've done it, but I'm creating a file here which says forename, surname, iSAMS data extract, and the date. And I'm populating it with the contents of the Word template that I just created. Now, what I need to do here is to basically make sure that I can now go and find that document. And again, these are all SharePoint sort of processes, which I'm not really going to go into here. But what I'm ultimately doing is I'm finding the folder that this document has been created in. Because the one thing that I probably didn't explain is that when it creates these files, it actually creates it within, it creates a folder within itself. So it's not just going to be the raw Word document. There's actually going to be a folder which is named the member of staff and their unique ID afterwards, just to ensure there's no conflict. And what I'm doing now is I'm getting the name of that document, the name of that folder that this has just created. And once I've done that, I'm actually then going to apply permissions to this folder. Again, these are all sort of functions that are within Power Automate. I'm not going to go through them here, but what I'm doing is I'm basically saying that the email address that I set a couple of stages back is going to be the person who has, in this instance, view only permissions to the folder, and within the folder the document that's just been created. And what I have down here is if the permission fails. Now it can fail because maybe the iSAMS email address, the school email address, isn't present. Maybe there isn't a school email address, so I needed really to have a sort of a what happens if, what to do if that happens. So what I've got here is I'm setting a default email address. In this example, I'm just giving it to my own email address, but it could be anything really. It's just a default. And what I'm saying here is that we are applying this default email address to that file and folder. So in effect, if the member of staff doesn't have an email address, then give this default permission to that file. Okay, and then finally, what I'm doing here is I'm just really sort of for reference, I'm creating an Excel spreadsheet, or updating an Excel spreadsheet that is actually going to give me the name of the folder, the name of the person that I've created this for, the permissions that were applied to it, and the date that this just happened. And the reason for that is so that I can sort of quite easily have a look and see all of those where the permissions was maybe the default rather than the true member of staff. So I can quickly see, without having to look through each folder, any of those where the permissions maybe are not have not been applied to that member of staff. And then I have the if Excel update fails. So in other words, if the row doesn't exist, then add a row. Because what this stage is doing here is updating the row if it already exists. So if I've run this process historically, providing I haven't deleted the Excel spreadsheet, the row is going to already exist. If it exists, it's going to update it. If it doesn't exist, in other words, it's a new member of staff, or this is the first time I'm running it, it's going to add the row. So really, that's the process. Now, I fully appreciate that that's quite a marathon there, but in effect, I just wanted to demonstrate that you can connect to the iSAMS API, and you can use the iSAMS API to get information, and you can use it in Power Automate to create documents. You can then upload those documents. You can create permissions on those documents. I fully appreciate that what I've just gone through there isn't exactly explaining how it all hangs together, but it hopefully gives a generic overview of what I've done. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's been particularly easy. There is a lot of moving parts here, and it's taken me a long time to get right. But the good news is it does work. And in our instance, there were about 186 records that I created as a test, and it took about an hour and a half to run. So, you know, there is a time aspect to this. But of course, if I was only wishing to create 3 records, or records where the query that I had at the top was limited down to a particular user, or, you know, I could put a value in here, then, you know, it would be a lot quicker. So it's been a bit of a journey, but it's been very valuable for me, and if nothing else, it might just demonstrate the possibilities.